Welcome back to Gaming Fact or Fiction, the game where you guess whether or not the following story is true. Let's begin. The Konami Code has been a famous button combination in the gaming world for decades. If you're not familiar, you would tap the buttons on your NES controller up, down, left, right, BA on the game Contra. When you hit start, you would begin the game with 30 lives, rather than 3. The code became famous as the Konami Code, Contra Code, or even simply the 30 lives cheat, but despite that, Contra isn't the only game to feature the code. In fact, Gradius included the combination, which was released prior to Contra. In Gradius, the code gives the player most of the power-ups in the game, which usually have to be found throughout the course of a playthrough. Kazuhisa Hashimoto created the code in 1985 when he realized that Gradius was rather difficult, so he added it in to ease his playtesting. This story was true. The code has been used in over 100 Konami games, but was really only ever popular with the game Contra. The gaming company Square is a prominent creator of role-playing games. Although they have, of course, made games of other genres, their most well-known franchise is Final Fantasy. If you've ever wondered how the franchise got its name, well, the answer's right there in the title. On the near-constant verge of bankruptcy for years, facing game cancellations and their development teams constantly reshuffled, Square had one last hope. Thought to be their very last game, Final Fantasy made for the perfect title. This short story was fiction. It's a common misconception that the game was named after the company's struggles, but the truth is less desperado. Square was not always struggling, and at one point before releasing Final Fantasy, they held offices in a very expensive district of Tokyo. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, admitted that they simply wanted a title that could be easily abbreviated in the Latin alphabet. The game would originally be called Fighting Fantasy before running into legal issues, eventually landing on Final Fantasy. He said that anything that started with an F would have been fine. Nintendo was home to some of the best-selling consoles of all time, but they also make franchises known across the globe like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. However, Nintendo was not always in the gaming industry. In fact, the company started in the 1960s selling various products in Japanese markets. Selling a little bit of everything, the president of Nintendo at the time decided that sticking to a single industry would make for cheaper production and thus higher profits. So in the early 80s, Nintendo began the development of the Famicom and subsequently the Nintendo Entertainment System, launching themselves into the gaming industry. This story is fiction. However, it is somewhat true. Nintendo did not start in the gaming industry. Nintendo was actually founded all the way back in 1889, selling Hanafuda cards, a type of Japanese playing card that are used in multiple card games. In the 1960s, the company did begin selling other things, but not a little bit of everything. They specifically sold toys and small electronics. Finally, the NES was not their launch into the industry. They actually helped develop a light gun accessory for the first commercial game console in the Magnavox Odyssey. While Nintendo did not create the concept of a handheld gaming device, it certainly popularized it with the 1989 release of the Game Boy. While I'm sure most of us are aware of the Game Boy, I'm not so sure about all of its officially released accessories. That's right, accessories sold separately, and with these add-ons we knew the Game Boy was clearly released unfinished. It would be virtually unusable without the Game Boy Pocket Sonar, a Japan-only device that used actual sonar in the water to detect fish, coming with a fishing minigame, somewhat more well known as the Game Boy camera and printer. The camera plugged right into the cartridge slot, allowing things like adding a picture of yourself as an avatar. The printer had to be plugged in with a cable, using the same technology used to print receipts, thermal paper. Other accessories included the Game Boy 4-player adapter, which allowed 4 Game Boys to be plugged in at once so players could compete in a surprisingly long list of games. Another official example includes the Handy Boy, manufactured by STD, which added speakers and a magnifier. Yes, these are all real, even the last one. In 1993, id Software released Doom, taking the world by storm overnight. The first-person shooter genre would never be the same, but do you know just how popular it was? The game was released in 2 separate ways. For the full game, featuring all 3 episodes, you had to send money and receive the floppy disks in the mail. However, through internet shareware, the first episode was entirely free. Although it's estimated that only 1% of shareware users ended up buying the full game, that was still enough to turn a massive profit due to the sheer number of downloaders. This mass of users led to stories like the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where id was initially unable to connect and upload the game to shareware as too many people were connected waiting to download it. The entire network later crashed when 10,000 people attempted to download it at once. It would later be estimated that Doom's shareware had been downloaded on more computers than Microsoft's Windows 95 edition, and all versions combined sold around 3.5 million copies by the end of the decade in 1999. This legendary tale is all true. If you've ever had an NES, you may have noticed an oddly shaped plastic cover on the bottom, but have you ever wondered what it's for? Well, if you take the cover off, you'll find this port. Nintendo was very forward-thinking. They knew that at some point they would want to release an expansion for the NES that could upgrade it. And so they did. In early 1986, Nintendo released a disk system expansion for the NES, which used proprietary floppy disks. They did this for a number of reasons. These floppy disks were cheaper to produce, had more storage space, and because they were rewritable, saving was possible without a save battery. This story was fiction. This expansion slot for the NES was never used for any official commercial product. However, a disc system was released for the Famicom in Japan. Nintendo did plan to release a similar expansion for the NES, but never got further than filing a patent for it. The disc system's slow loading times and poor manufacturing quality led to its downfall in Japan by 1989. Technological advancements made cartridges easier to produce anyway, so the plans were permanently scrapped. Quake, a game released by id Software in 1996, was the successor to the original Doom and revolutionized 3D games. The Quake Engine created a multitude of ways to make 3D rendering significantly faster and more viable. So viable that, in fact, games today still have pieces of the Quake Engine in them. The span of the Quake Engine is absolutely astounding, as shown in some of these family trees. This one shows the family of engines it spawned, an immediately large number of derivatives, but eventually makes it all the way to 2020's Doom Eternal. This one features a tree of games that use these derivative engines and especially highlights the spread of Valve's source engine. Essentially every Valve game, but also stretches all the way to Apex Legends from the Titanfall engine. There's also some Star Wars games, the new Wolfenstein games, and the entirety of the Call of Duty franchise included as well. This was another astonishing fact from id Software. The most surprising thing I found is the exact same light flickering effect found in Quake can also be found in Half-Life Alyx, released 24 years later. 1998's Half-Life was a giant success and launched Valve into the gaming industry. Valve would go on to produce or publish many more games and expansions for the Half-Life franchise, including 2 expansions for their first game, Half-Life Blue Shift and Half-Life Opposing Force. However, something many didn't know is that there was a 3rd expansion on the way from Valve themselves called Half-Life Event Horizon. Event Horizon had a planned release date of 2002 and was not outsourced to Gearbox unlike the other expansions. This small expansion pack with around 2 or 3 hours of planned gameplay features Eli Vance as the player character, along with Dr. Kleiner being a large part of the plot. It would otherwise have the same setting as the original Half-Life. This expansion was also meant to highlight some of Valve's updates to the Gold Source engine, which would eventually become the new source engine for games like Counter-Strike Source and Half-Life 2. This story was fiction. That's right, I completely made this expansion pack up. However, there is a decent amount of unreleased Half-Life content, which we may cover in later videos. This time I'll talk about some of the last games ever released on their respective consoles. 2 are facts, and 1 is fiction. As for the NES, the last officially licensed NES game in North America may surprise you, and that's because it was actually developed by Nintendo themselves. This would be Wario's Woods, released in December of 1994, over 3 years after the release of the Super Nintendo, but they still decided to port the SNES game backwards to the NES. For the SNES, the answer was also quite shocking. This would be a port of 1981's arcade game Frogger, released in 1998, 17 years after the original. However, games for the SNES were released in Japan up until 2000, like a Fire Emblem game that never made it to the States at all. Finally, the last official release on the PlayStation 1 in North America. In October of 2004, FIFA 2005 was released. To put that into perspective, just over a month later, Half-Life 2 would release. The first 2 are true, but the PlayStation's last release was actually a Capcom port of the 1989 Strider arcade game ported over in 2006. Originally, the blue ships were not only to attempt to crash into you, but also fire projectiles. The parallax background was one of the easiest features to implement in the game. Rutabaga III was originally going to be an artichoke, and we toyed with either the second player being a rhubarb or it being added as a third option. The lore was completely made up hastily on the spot after the production of the game. Many of the Steve achievements are references to 80s action movies, including 3 Star Wars references. The red projectile sometimes fired by the flying oppression cube was never meant to look that way. It was meant to be a single projectile, but a glitch caused it to fire multiple in a line, and it was kept in. Our original estimations of development time were surprisingly accurate. The blue ships once had this firing animation. The background was actually one of the hardest parts of our development, an original artichoke sketch. The lore actually became a running joke throughout the development. Here are some of the achievement icons. This was the original red sprite, and about that development time, yeah, we were dead wrong. The opening sequence in Half-Life 2 was originally proposed to be much longer. Rather than beginning on a train to City 17, you find yourself amongst lush hills with a utopian city over the horizon. Of course, we still have an opening monologue from the G-Man, but he does a better job explaining the circumstances than he does in the final version of the game. In the actual game, the G-Man merely tells you to wake up, implies you are needed and that the world is in a poor state. However, in the original proposed opening, he makes it clear that 10 years have passed without your knowing, and he clearly shows you the world's current state. Lush hills gradually lose their color, trees die off, the sky blackens, and towers in the distance fall. Eventually, a train arrives and the G-Man tells you to board it. Here you meet a character named Samuel that tells you about the Combine. He also hands you a gas mask as the atmosphere is no longer survivable, and other characters on the train have a lot more dialogue than they do in the final game. Interestingly enough, this story was true. This proposed opening back in 2000 was cut early on, but would you have rather seen this opening in the final game? In 1983, the video game market in America crashed. Home video game revenue went from its peak in 1983 at $3.2 billion to plummet by 1985 to only $100 million. This drop of nearly 97% was attributed to many factors, but mainly an oversaturated market of home game consoles, many of which were manufactured poorly. 1983 also saw the release of Nintendo's Famicom system in Japan, which was met with great commercial success. Originally, Nintendo intended to make a deal with Atari to help market the Famicom as the Nintendo Enhanced Video System in America, but amid Atari's collapse, the deal fell through. Instead, Nintendo developed a Nintendo Versus system, an arcade cabinet. When this system did well, they began porting the Famicom over to North America. Originally, the North American Famicom would be known as the Nintendo Advanced Video System and resemble a home computer, much like what saturated the market. However, in a somewhat stroke of genius, Nintendo redesigned it to look more like a VCR to avoid the stigma surrounding the crash. This story was true. Super Mario 64 has always been a prominent game in the speedrunning community, but it would never be the same after a specific speedrun attempt in 2013. A user by the name of Dota Teabag was performing a speedrun of Mario 64 when Mario suddenly teleported up multiple objects, instantly progressing through a small section of the level. The player was immediately shocked as he had just witnessed something never seen before. After years of attempted replication couldn't recreate the glitch, the community decided it must have been something called a single event upset. This is an extremely rare phenomenon in which an ionizing particle, typically something from stars in outer space, collides with a microelectric device. These particles' electric charges can be enough to change information in the software, specifically in the form of an integer value stored as a bit. Simply put, it could change a single 0 to a 1 or vice versa. In Dota Teabag's case, this flip of a single bit was enough to change Mario's height value to perfectly land on a platform above him. The story could be true, but we may never know. Maps are an important part of navigating large worlds in video games, and it seems they've been around in games for quite some time. I was recently curious about which game had the first map, and my first thought was the world map in Final Fantasy. Funny enough, this map was actually somewhat of a secret. If you press the B and select buttons at the same time, you can open the map in-game, and this was hinted at by a broom in Matoya's cave that tells you to push B and select backwards. However, the first game I could find with a map would be Legend of Zelda in 1987. Not only did this game allow you to view the overworld, but dungeons had their own maps as well, some of which with interesting shapes. In dungeons, if you found the map item, it would reveal the entire map, while the compass item would show you your position on it. While The Legend of Zelda was heavily influential, it was not the first game to have some kind of map, so this was a fiction. The earliest game I could find is actually a childhood favorite of mine, Rally X, which released in 1980. It featured a minimap on the side showing your car, the enemies chasing you, and the flag pickups. Everyone knows the ESRB rating system that lets us know if games are E for everyone, M for mature, etc., but it is odd to think about how that was not always so. Amid a growing panic in the early 90s over violence in video games, U.S. Senate committees held congressional hearings on the topic. These two hearings in 1993 and 1994 with representatives for Nintendo and Sega, along with educators and video game distributors, were held mostly due to the concern over Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and Doom. Mortal Kombat and Doom were known to feature bloody and violent gameplay, while Night Trap, the lesser known of the trio, features full motion video of often sexual nature, though it also had violence. Although Senator Lieberman introduced the Video Game Rating Act, which would institute a 5-member panel appointed by the president, it would never come to fruition. Instead, a large trade group in the gaming industry, the Entertainment Software Association, agreed to set up its own board for reviewing games, which would be called the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB. This story was true. Sony has been in electronics far longer than Nintendo. They got their start with radios in the mid-40s and became known for videotape recorders and audio players like the Walkman. However, they wouldn't enter the video game industry until 1994 with the release of their PlayStation. The SNES could only replicate 3D-like effects, while the PlayStation was built on 3D polygons and used CD-ROMs, which have more storage and are cheaper to produce. This launched the rivalry between Nintendo and Sony. This story was inaccurate. The PlayStation was not Sony's first video game venture. They operated a game studio known as Sony ImageSoft since 1989 and often supplied components for other consoles. Most notably, they had a partnership with Nintendo and supplied them with sound chips for the Super Famicom. Originally, the PlayStation would be merely a CD-ROM expansion for the Nintendo's SNES. When Nintendo decided to switch to Philips, the deal fell through. Sony's president was infuriated by this and quickly appointed Ken Kutaragi to turn the expansion into a full console. Secret characters have been a popular trope in fighting games for some time now, whether they're playable characters or just challenging bosses. Akuma in Street Fighter II Turbo, the Master Hand in Smash Melee, or even Pepsi Man in the Japan version of Fighting Vipers are all great examples. Of course, this got me thinking on what the first game to do this was. You might have noticed I didn't mention Mortal Kombat, as this would be the correct answer. In its first installment, Mortal Kombat had a secret boss, Reptile. who was a palette swap of Scorpion and Sub-Zero. The original Mortal Kombat 1 was released in 1992, and this would be the first fighting game to feature a secret character. And by secret, I mean unlocking this boss was a hassle. On a specific stage, Pit, you needed to get lucky and see an object fly across the moon. If this were to happen, you needed to achieve a double flawless victory without blocking a single time, and then perform a fatality. This story was true. Reptile would lead to the common secret character trope. The NES was famously bundled with a copy of Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, along with a light gun and an extra controller for $149.99 or around $440 in 2024. This is a pretty sweet deal considering new releases could be sold for around $40 or more, which is well over $100 per game today. While I assume that the inclusion of 2 games and extra hardware with the NES was to help with its release in spite of the previous crash in the gaming market, it should be mentioned that consoles before the crash did package with games as well. The Atari 2600 was released in 1977 and was packaged with Activision's famous Pitfall. This game was far beyond the realm of what previous consoles like the Magnavox Odyssey had to offer. It was also beyond what most of the 2600 games had to offer, so giving it to the customer was a good deal. This story was misleading. The Atari 2600 was not packaged with Pitfall as it released 5 years later. It was actually bundled with Combat and later Pac-Man. Arguing that any of these bundles were great deals seems far-fetched considering gaming has only gotten significantly cheaper. I usually talk about retro games and our guessing game here on the channel, but let's face it, the gaming market is significantly larger now than it was in the late 80s and early 90s, so when I was thinking about the best-selling consoles, I inevitably came up with new school devices. Although the Wii was a huge hit in 2006, its successor, the Wii U, infamously flopped. However, Nintendo's next console, the Switch, sold a staggering number of devices, over 140 million. Of course, I am messing with you because the real best-selling gaming device would actually be Nintendo's DS, released in 2004, selling 154 million copies, most of which were actually the DS Lite model. The small handheld was 32-bit and offered a multitude of interesting features that made for many unique games that would hit a multitude of demographics. Some of you may have realized that this story was false, because the DS comes in second place for best-selling console behind the PlayStation 2 by only a million. Maybe gaming isn't so much bigger now after all, as interestingly the NES sold more copies in the 80s than the PlayStation 5 did these days. After talking about the best-selling console, I would love to talk about the best-selling game of all time, but I think most people will correctly guess that it's Minecraft. Instead, I'll talk about the best-selling games on specific consoles, and you'll guess what's right and wrong. PlayStation 2 wins for the best-selling console, but do you know its best-selling game? That will be the third installment of the popular PlayStation classic, Gran Turismo. As for some Nintendo consoles, what about the N64? Well, it's pretty obvious, of course, it is Mario 64. As for the SNES, we could count Super Mario World, but in fairness, it was a pack-in game, so second place is more interesting. Second place belongs to Super Mario Kart. As for PlayStation 4, we have the obvious GTA 5. Although Connected Ventures wins it for the Xbox 360, but it was a pack-in title, so GTA 5 still takes the cake. Let's see how you did. PlayStation 2's best-selling game was actually GTA San Andreas. The second game for SNES would actually be Super Mario All-Stars, and finally, PlayStation 4 actually sold more copies of Marvel's Spider-Man. Many know of Valve's 1998 game, Half-Life. There's also the well-known expansions from Gearbox Software called Blue Shift and Opposing Force. However, I'm aware of a lesser-known expansion called Half-Life Decay. I was already aware of it and wrongfully called my made-up expansion the third Half-Life expansion, as a clue to the viewers to know it was false. I have been made painfully aware of Half-Life Decay quite thoroughly, so here I am talking about it. This expansion released with Half-Life's port to PlayStation 2 and never ported to any other console or to PC. The expansion is multiplayer only with split-screen action featuring 2 colleagues of Gordon Freeman as playable characters. Specifically, Gina Cross, who could be seen in various places across the franchise, and Colette Green, a new character. I did loosely base Event Horizon off of a real unreleased expansion called Hostile Takeover, which was meant to release in 2000. It was indeed not outsourced to Gearbox, but instead a studio known as 2015. All of this was painfully true. 2017's Hollow Knight was released by Team Cherry to instant success. The game was funded through Kickstarter, reaching far beyond its original goals. This game that sold nearly 3 million copies worldwide started in a game jam in 2013. Ludum Dare is a game jam that offers its competitors only 72 hours to create a playable video game that sticks to a specific theme. Ludum Dare 27 in 2013 had the theme 10 seconds, which could be used in virtually any way. Team Cherry conceived of a game called Hungry Knight, in which the familiar-looking knight would get hungry every 10 seconds. The player would have to explore a grassy area and attack enemies to get food. The game ended up getting 1 star on Newgrounds, but Ari Gibson and William Pellin decided to build on its idea anyway. Drawing inspiration from the Metroid franchise and Legend of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, they began creating Hollow Knight. This somewhat inspiring story was true. I'm sure many Hollow Knight superfans already know it, but I figured I'd talk about it anyway. I'm sure we're all well aware of the game Pong. Atari created many new versions of Pong, including Home Pong, Super Pong, Ultra Pong, Pong Doubles, Ultra Pong Doubles, Pin Pong, Quadra Pong, Puppy Pong, Super Ultra Pong, Hockey Pong, Super Pong 10, and Pong 4. Of these original Atari releases, do you know which is fake? Super Pong and Ultra Pong both offered more game variants of Pong, while Super Ultra Pong offered even more. Pong Doubles allowed 4 players, while Ultra Pong Doubles did the same but with extra variants. Puppy Pong was made for children's doctor's offices and would originally be called Snoopy's Pong. Hockey Pong is only one variant of the console, but it features 2 paddles per player and a small goal. Quadra Pong featured vertical gameplay and different wall variants. Super Pong 10 also offers 4 players and 10 variants, while I could not find much on Pong 4. Pin Pong was essentially just a video pinball machine. I think only a highly dedicated Pong expert would be certain that Super Ultra Pong is the fake. I've talked about Half-Life a lot on this channel and mentioned its developer Valve, but I haven't talked about them much, unlike Nintendo or Sony, for example. Valve's president, Gabe Newell, became somewhat of an internet meme, but the origin story of Valve is an interesting tale. Gabe Newell dropped out of Harvard University to join Bill Gates at Microsoft in 1983. In his 13 years at Microsoft, Newell was involved in the first 3 releases of Windows operating systems, and interestingly, the Windows 95 port for Doom, which in large part helped Windows become a viable gaming platform. It became somewhat common for the pioneers at Microsoft in the late 80s and early 90s to leave and make their own businesses. Newell was inspired by a friend of his that left Microsoft and joined id to work on the classic shooter Quake. Newell and Mike Harrington left Microsoft to form Valve in 1996 and started funding the development of Half-Life. Later, he would give Valve no deadline and virtually unlimited money for Half-Life 2 while he worked on the early stages of development for Steam. The story was true. Rocket League is a popular online game centered around vehicular soccer. It has a fairly large community and following, but does every player know that Rocket League is actually a sequel? That's correct. In 2008, Rocket League's publisher Psyonix published a game called Supersonic Acrobatic Rocket Power Battle Cars, often abbreviated as SART Battle Cars, for the PlayStation 3. The game was not well received by critics and didn't attract all that much attention despite being fairly similar to its successor Rocket League. Its physics engine did work a little differently. The ball was much bouncier and boost was much more powerful, but aside from that, the game worked around the same concept. In 2011, Psyonix would announce the development of a sequel, and 7 years after Supersonic Acrobatic Rocket Power Battle Cars, Psyonix published Rocket League, which would become a huge hit and even create quite a large esports scene. This story was true. Rocket League's predecessor lives in relative obscurity, but is referenced in-game, even having a goal theme named after it. I found a few unused lines of dialogue from the Half-Life franchise's G-Man. Can you tell which ones are real and which ones I made up? An unused soundbite from Half-Life 2 Episode 1 reads, well, shit. This stood out to me because I can't find any instance of the G-Man cursing in any used dialogue. Another piece of unused dialogue comes from Opposing Force, which reads, the biggest embarrassment has been Black Mesa Facility, but I think that's finally taken care of itself. Also from Opposing Force, there is an unused clip reading, unfortunately you've witnessed a great deal, including the escapades of Gordon Freeman. You'll need to be detained. Finally, in his outro speech in Half-Life 1, there's an unused dialogue, but there are a few survivors of your personal holocaust who would like the chance to meet the man responsible for the total annihilation of their race. I've been a bit cheeky with you. My first dialogue from Opposing Force was in fact not unused, but it was in the game. However, my second Opposing Force dialogue was indeed made up. 1978's Space Invaders is, of course, a well-known classic and a large part of the gaming industry's success in the late 70s. One of the most interesting features in the game, however, was actually unintentional. As the player destroys more ships in Space Invaders, they begin to speed up, making the game more difficult as it goes on. This was merely an effect of programming and poor processing power. With fewer ships on screen, the specially developed hardware this game used was able to process frames more quickly and increase the frame rate. Because the ship's movement was updated on each frame, they would begin to move faster. The developer, Tomohiro Nishikado, decided that this was an interesting feature and not just a bug, so it was worth leaving in. This story was true. That's right, Space Invaders invented the difficulty curve by accident. Over the years, big games have become a lot more expensive to develop and advertise, and we know AAA companies are willing to dump large sums of money into a single release, but it's interesting to look at what the most expensive games are. That answer depends on how you define expensive, whether you're talking about development, advertising, or the total, and even then, the figures can be disputed. Talking in totals, Grand Theft Auto V had been the most expensive game ever made for some time, eventually being beaten by similar releases like Red Dead Redemption 2, but will be completely overtaken by a still yet to be released game, Star Citizen. This early access game has cost Cloud Imperium over $500 million in development alone and another $100 million plus in marketing, making it the most expensive game ever made by far. The story was False. There is another titan that has cost its developer even more. Surprisingly, Genshin Impact. Over $700 million have been spent in its development and marketing. Also, somehow Monopoly Go has spent $500 million in marketing.